Hello there, this is David Roche. I'm going to talk to you now about the latest US and Allied arms package for Ukraine, and to explain to you why this does not actually change our analysis that we are not arming Ukraine to win this war decisively. We are arming Ukraine not to lose this war, and this package at $3.75 billion US dollars is obviously substantial, and that's the figure for the US alone. But it is not enough and does not include the sort of weapons which would allow Ukraine to actually seize control of a territory as significant as Crimea from the Russians and totally disrupt their supply chains, because they do not include the sort of weapon that would capabilize the Ukrainians to do just that. Therefore, the war will continue to be a war of attrition with a greater success ratio for Ukraine than previously, but it does not change the nature of the war. That means it will go on a long time. It is likely to go on longer than Putin will live, which may be one of the points at which a turning point could be achieved. But it is not something that is going to take the burden off economies or the cost of war or the knock-on effects on financial markets of the cost of war. Let me explain to you why I see this. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is Ukraine actually asking for? Now, Valery Zaluzhnyi, who is the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, has repeatedly asked for long-range missiles, such as long-range HIMARS. And here we're talking about ranges of certainly 800 and probably over 1,000 kilometers. He has asked for 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles and 300 up-to-date, state-of-the-art battle tanks. How far does the present package from all of the allies go to meet this requirement? Nobody doubts, I think, that the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Zaluzhnyi, is incompetent. He is highly competent and has written and quantified these needs on several occasions, and these have not been called into question as propaganda. The latest package, as I said, which totals a massive $3.75 billion US dollars from the US alone, promises Ukraine at the top end of the range infantry fighting vehicles. What are these? Well, to name them by their names, the US is supplying M2 Bradleys, probably of the order of around 50, plus a lot of other weaponry and ammunition. But that's the top of the range. Germany is supplying Marders, Marder 1s, which are also an infantry fighting vehicle and a very good one. And the French are supplying the AMX-10, which they are phasing out for their own armed forces as being out of date and replacing with what is called the Javelin, which is a much less effective vehicle. It's a wheeled vehicle, not a tracked vehicle, etc. Now, there are two things to be said about this number. This is the top end of the range of the weaponry. The numbers, though preliminary, fall far short of what the Ukraine actually needs, even in terms of infantry fighting vehicles. Secondly, infantry fighting vehicles are not tanks. They have been called tank killers, but they really are not. They are for transporting troops around the fields in various numbers, but quite small, probably between, in the case of the French, 4 troops. In the case of the bigger vehicles like the Abrams, say 8 to 10 people, in addition to the crew of the vehicle itself. They have light armaments. Only one of these vehicles that I named has actually any missile capability. And on those two counts, obviously, infantry fighting vehicles fall well short of what the Ukrainians actually need in terms of the type of vehicle and in terms of the number. However, we have to acknowledge one thing which can shift this judgment, but has not done so far. And that is that arms packages tend to act like stones thrown into ponds. They create ripple effects. Other countries try to catch up and appear to be on the case and as pro-Ukrainian as the three countries which have so far announced what they are going to supply to Ukraine. So we can expect more announcements. Now, those announcements are material because there will be more infantry fighting vehicles, and they are significant because they will involve tanks. In other words, by the very nature of the ripple effect, people will try and do better than the original announcement. And I think it's fair to say that that will involve tanks. Now, what tanks? Well, there are several forms of tanks which could be supplied to Ukraine. One are, of course, the Abrams tank from the United States, which is not to be confused with the Abrams infantry fighting vehicle. But the US doesn't want to be the first to supply these tanks. So they actually want the Europeans to supply Leopard tanks, Leopard Mark II tanks, which are state-of-the-art German tanks, which I will come back to in a minute. And we are also seeing the British suggesting that they will supply their own battle tank, which is an excellent fighting tank which is called the Chieftain. Now, Poland has said they would like to supply these tanks. They have them. The Baltic states, several of them have said they would like to supply these tanks. And the Finnish government has said they too would like to supply these tanks, provided somebody else does so too. Or maybe I could rephrase that and say perhaps somebody else will supply it first. Then the Finns will step in. Okay, now, the reason why this could be significant is that there are 2,000 Leopard tanks in service in European NATO countries, and probably about another 100 in Canada. So you could see that if the ripple effect caused European countries or NATO countries to give up 10% of their Leopard 2 tanks, you would have covered 2/3 of the needs of Ukraine for heavy tanks. So one should not underestimate what goes on behind the scenes, and one should not underestimate ripple effects. But the point I'm making, the package is, as it is announced, does not include this. We shall watch the space very carefully, but it has not happened yet. Perhaps the most important thing that is being discussed, not exactly behind the scenes, but certainly not included in this package, so part of the ripple effect, is a discussion of the US creating a new ground-launched medium-range missile with about 150 kilometers range, called the GLSDB. This is based on the Boeing Saab GRU-39 small diameter bomb missile, but this one is powered by an M26 rocket motor, which would allow it to be launched from the ground, whereas previous versions had to be launched from an aircraft or a helicopter. There is also, of course, the fact that Ukrainian fighter pilots are being trained in the US at the moment to fly the F-16 fighter, and that there are plans to supply Ukraine with the MQ-1C Grey Eagle drones, which would come in addition and not as part of this package, but down the road. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that this package does not reach either the category of weapons or the quantities which would substantially enable Ukraine to decisively win this war, but that the ripple effects have to be watched very carefully, because this package may be added to not only in terms of the numbers of weapons included in it and the ammunition and everything else, and the training of soldiers to run these infantry fighting vehicles, but the package may be shifted in terms of including in it higher capacity weapons, particularly in terms of tanks, and the promising prospect of perhaps the new GLSDB US missile, which is still too short a range, but is a step in the right direction, being added to the package too. We shall thus watch this space very closely. But at the moment, even if you include the battle tanks, in addition to the infantry fighting vehicles, and all the other forms of aid which are going on both behind the scenes and as a part of this package, such as, for example, armored personnel carriers by the US, M113s, and mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles called MRAPs and Humvees. If you include all of these things together, what this package speaks to is a continued war in which infantry are used in conjunction at the top end with tanks, as they are supposed to be, and infantry fighting vehicles, which would be a relatively slow attrition-based war in which the capability of the Ukrainians to advance across Russian-held territory would be increased, but it would not give the Ukrainians the sort of missiles which could attack Russian supply lines or cut off Crimea in a substantial way inside Russian territory. So it tells us that the Allies are tiptoeing towards an empowerment of Ukraine, which would be what is needed to win the war, but they are not there yet. They are still, the Allies, playing this war according to Russian rules. In other words, there are red lines drawn by Putin, not by the Allies, but which the Allies observe. They do not want to push Putin too far for two reasons. Number one is because they fear he might use the nuclear option, of course, or chemical weapons. And number two, of course, they fear that if they push Putin too far, he won't take any of the off-ramps for negotiation, which behind the scenes, they are still keeping on the table or just under the table. It's my view that this is based on a complete miscalculation of what Putin is about. He is about as interested in off-ramps as I am in swallowing the small computer which I'm making this this recording on, and the chance of him using nuclear weapons is highly unlikely because he knows that would be signing his own death warrant. So I continue to think that this is a significant development, but it is not a major breakthrough armament program for Ukraine that would terminate this war with the end of Putin. I think that will come, but I think we are crawling towards it in a fashion which will cost many thousands of Ukrainian lives. So what do I say? Good try, not quite there.